Picture yourself in a dim, smoky hall, its timber beams creaking gently in the hush of twilight. Notice the flicker of a low fire, casting warm, drowsy shadows against crumbling stone, and the scent of wood smoke lingering like an old memory. Let this quiet moment melt into a simpler world, far removed from our own, where silence clings to cold stone and bread is torn with bare, unwashed hands. Tonight our story will drift along the curious and unhurried paths of medieval dining. Not the grand feasts of kings, but the quiet, everyday meals of ordinary folk, eaten with fingers shared from wooden bowls and never rushed. There are no grand triumphs to chase, no complex puzzles to solve. Simply let this gentle tale become a quiet current, carrying your thoughts toward peaceful rest. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen, and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. There were no sinks, no lavender-scented soap, no bright kitchen filled with polished spoons or drawers of gleaming forks. If you wanted to eat in the Middle Ages, you used what you had, your hands, and you didn't always wash them first, not out of rudeness, but because the concept of clean looked different back then. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about being presentable, and even that was a flexible term. For most people, peasants, artisans, labourers, your hands were tools long before they were utensils. You used them to dig ditches, wring out laundry, pull weeds, shear sheep, chop wood, milk goats, and when the day was over, you sat down with those same hands and tore bread, scooped stew and scraped bowls clean. If you remembered, you might rub them on your apron or rinse them in a nearby basin, but no one expected you to arrive at the table scrubbed pink and glistening. That kind of washing was reserved for feast days or funerals. Instead, the meal began as it always did, simple, communal, familiar. The pot was ladled into wooden bowls or more often poured directly onto a trencher. An old slice of coarse bread, hard as a cutting board, used as both plate and sponge. Around this softening slab, fingers gathered. You tore off a corner, dipped it, licked your thumb, reached for another piece. The food was hot, but not scalding. Enough to steam the dirt off your fingers, maybe. Not enough to burn the grease from your nails. No one flinched, because no one noticed. Hygiene, in our modern sense, simply wasn't part of the conversation. Germ theory wouldn't exist for centuries. Disease was blamed on foul air, bad water, a restless spirit, or a sin not yet confessed. The idea that something invisible could pass from a calloused fingertip to a crust of bread and into your gut wasn't considered. And even if it had been, what were the options? Soap was rare. Clean water, rarer still. If the stream wasn't frozen, muddy, or fouled by animals upstream, you used it. Otherwise, you made do. You weren't careless. Psst. You were practical. And practicality meant you wiped your hands on straw or on your tunic. You rinsed them in the basin, even if 3 others had done the same before you. You cleaned your nails with a knife if you had time. And then you ate. Because food was warm, the fire was low, the ale was flat but safe, and the children were already dipping their fingers in before you could think twice. Meals were short. There wasn't time for formality. You ate quickly because the daylight was brief and the chores endless. You chewed with your mouth closed, if you remembered. You didn't speak much, not because silence was sacred, but because your mouth was busy and your hands for once were still. If someone sneezed, no one paused. If someone coughed into their palm and then passed you the trencher, you didn't flinch. You tore a piece, dipped it in broth, and chewed slowly, warming your belly one bite at a time, because hunger dulled disgust, and routine dulled awareness. This was how everyone ate. Even in castles, hands did the heavy lifting. Nobles washed more often, yes, warm basins scented with rosemary or lemon peel, servants standing by with towels. But even then, the same hands that had just ridden a horse or signed a scroll or adjusted a hound's collar were soon elbow-deep in roast goose and dripping with fig sauce. Forks existed, but they were oddities, decorative, foreign. Knives did most of the work. Your hands did the rest. And no one used gloves. That would have been absurd. The fingers were trusted, efficient, and expected to be dirty. Cleanliness was not the virtue. Participation was. You sat, you ate, you tore, you wiped, you drank, you shared. The food was warm, the company was real, and no one asked, "Have you washed your hands?" Because if they had, the answer wouldn't have mattered. The stew was already halfway gone, and everyone's hands were in it. The more you think about it, the stranger it seems that no one thought to question it. Not the farmer who scraped manure from his boots before entering the kitchen. Not the child who wiped a runny nose on his sleeve, then grabbed a slice of cheese from the table. Not the wife who chopped onions with hands that had been wrist-deep in laundry water moments before. It just happened. People ate with dirty hands and dinner went on, because hunger didn't care what was under your nails. You see, for the medieval household, rich or poor, eating was a matter of function, not finesse. The primary goal was to stay fed, not to stay clean. It wasn't that they didn't want cleanliness, but rather they measured it differently. Mud and ash and barnyard smells were part of daily life. You were judged more harshly for greed or waste than for grime. A man who stole the last piece of bread was rude. A man with soil under his nails, that was just Tuesday. The hands, in this world, were more than just eating tools. They were extensions of everything else: labour, ritual, social order. A craftsman's fingers bore the marks of his trade: blisters, ink, calluses. A woman's hands were red from washing, cracked from cold water and harsh wool. These same hands turned spoons, passed bowls, tore bread, and held their children close. No one expected them to sparkle. If they had time to rinse, fine. If not, dinner couldn't wait. And it wasn't just what the hands touched, it was how they touched. There were shared bowls, sometimes one between 3 or 4, each person dipped in. Bread was passed hand to hand, softened in broth, then bitten, then passed again. You didn't flinch if someone else's fingers brushed yours or if their grip left a damp imprint on the crust. You didn't ask whether they'd coughed that morning or scratched at a rash. You looked them in the eye, tore your portion, and said thank you. Because the danger wasn't dirt, it was disconnection. Meals were social. To refuse food or refuse to share was worse than sharing it with unwashed hands. Even the act of eating was a way to reaffirm your place in the household, the village, the world. And so you reached out and you took and you trusted. And if your stomach complained later, that was the price. In wealthier homes, the rules were only slightly different. You were expected to look clean, especially if guests were present. A servant might pour water over your fingers before the meal. A towel might be handed to you between courses. A scented cloth might be passed after meat was served. But it was all surface. No scrubbing, no soap. Just enough to say, we've done our part. And the rest was ceremony. At the table, even among nobles, the same basics applied. Fingers tore meat, dipped crusts, scooped fruit from dishes. The cutlery was limited. The knives were personal, and hands still went to the mouth more often than not. You could see grease on the cuffs of the velvet tunics, hear the wet sound of teeth pulling meat from bone, see the smear of honey on a polished goblet. They weren't cleaner, they were just better at pretending. And even then, the cooks weren't clean at all. Kitchen hands were too busy to wash between each task. They rolled dough with dusty palms, rubbed herbs onto birds with fingers still sticky from skinning eels, carried sacks of flour, wiped sweat from their brows, and went straight back to stirring the pot. Gloves didn't exist, fingernails were long and dark and unbothered. The baker scratched his beard, then kneaded the loaf. The dairymaid licked a spoon, then dipped it back in the curd. And yet the food was served, and people ate, and life continued. Because food was a blessing, not a performance, and if the hands that delivered it were less than pure, well, so were the roads, so were the beds, so was everything else, so what difference did it make? By the end of the meal, your hands were stickier than when you began. Bits of soft cheese under the nails, a line of stew down your thumb, bread crusts clinging to your palm, maybe some grease at the corners of your mouth. There were no napkins, not really, just your sleeve, or the edge of the tablecloth, or a strip of cloth tied loosely to your belt if you were someone important. But for most, wiping hands clean was more about comfort than sanitation, and even that was relative, because what was clean, really? In the medieval world, cleanliness wasn't about being sterile, it was about being presentable, socially acceptable. You washed your face before church, not because it prevented illness, but because it showed respect. You rinsed your hands after slaughter, not before supper. If you were a guest at a noble table, you might receive a scented cloth to wipe your fingers, but no one expected you to use it before you touched the food. That would be excessive. Clean meant not offensive, not distracting, not smudged with something too obviously foul. And even then, the tolerance was wide. A bit of soot under the nails was expected. A streak of ash across the wrist, a spot of blood on the knuckle from chopping onions, none of this was shocking, not even worth mentioning. Children learned this early. They didn't ask why they had to share a bowl with their siblings. They didn't whine if the bread was damp with someone else's spit. They didn't wait to wash. They grabbed, tore, chewed. and if their hands were dirty, they were scolded only if they wiped them on the wall. Not for eating with them, that was simply how it was done. And if someone fell ill, well, maybe it was the wind, maybe it was the water, maybe it was God's will. No one blamed the cook's hands, no one blamed the trencher that had been shared 5 ways, because there was no cause and effect, only rhythm. And meals had a rhythm of their own. Scoop, chew, pass, wipe. Even sickness couldn't interrupt it for long. In fact, only death could. And even then someone would finish your portion before it spoiled. So the hand stayed busy. Dirty, yes, but skip-dilled. Trusted. They cooked, they fed, they served. They taught children how to roll dough, how to test soup with a fingertip, how to break bread so that the crust fell evenly between 2 palms. They scraped bowls and pinched salt and picked bones. They tore meat and braided onions and poured ale. They pressed prayers into flour and signed blessings over broth. And in doing so, they created something that no amount of dirt could diminish. A table where people gathered, where hunger was stilled if only for a while, where silence passed like bread from hand to hand. And maybe that was the cleanest thing of all. It was square, dense, and stale enough to stop a blade. That was the point. Trencher bread wasn't made to be soft or fluffy. It wasn't meant to be sliced or slathered with anything sweet. It was meant to sit at the centre of your meal, take the weight of the stew, absorb the grease of a roasted bird, and stay strong enough not to disintegrate when hot food hit its surface. You didn't bake a trencher to eat it. You baked it to hold what you would eat. And when you were done, well, then it became food too. If not for you, then for someone. The idea of using bread as a plate seems strange to us now, but in the medieval world it was common sense. Wood was valuable, metal even more so, and ceramic, prone to cracking, expensive to replace and heavy to carry. Bread, on the other hand, could be baked in batches, shaped to fit the table, and tossed to pigs or paupers when it had served its purpose. Parenture was utility baked into form, stiff, dry, and made days in advance. No one ate fresh trenchers. That would be wasteful. They were usually cut from coarse brown loaves made with rye or barley. No wheat, unless you were wealthy or lucky. The loaves were left to harden for 2, maybe 3 days, long enough for the crust to thicken, and the interior to lose its give. Then they were sliced into slabs, usually 4 inches thick and 6 to 8 inches across. Just big enough to hold a ladle of pottage, a spoonful of beans, or a slab of pork that had been stewing since morning. You didn't serve a meal on a trencher, you served a meal into it. At the table, the trencher sat where a plate might sit now. 2 people often shared one. You'd sit across from each other, dipping in from either side, tearing from the edge inward, careful not to collapse the whole thing before the meat was finished. If the food was runny, the trencher caught it. If it was greasy, the trencher soaked it. If the meat was tough, you sliced it with your knife, the point grating into the crust like it was bark. And once the top was clear, once the stew was eaten, the beans gone, the gravy licked clean, you were left with a decision. Do you eat the trencher? That depended on your place in the world. If you were rich, probably not. The bread had done its job. It had absorbed the flavours, kept your sleeves clean, soaked up what the cloth napkins wouldn't. Now it was soft with juice, squeeze it through its corners, and rich with meat drippings, but your belly was already full. So the trencher went to the dogs, or more commonly to the poor. Gathered into baskets, the discarded trenchers were handed out to beggars waiting by the door or tossed into the alms chest for the church to distribute. This wasn't charity born of kindness, it was practical. A reused trencher still had life in it. To waste it completely would be foolish. But if you were poor, the trencher never left the table. You ate it. You tore pieces from the soggiest corner and chewed slowly, letting the salt and fat soak into your tongue. You worked your way around the edge, dipping it in whatever was left in the bowl, softening the dry parts until they were edible. You might share the soggiest corner with a child. You might wrap the last dry edge in cloth to save for the next day's meal. But you didn't throw it out, not when every bite counted. Children grew up on trenchers. They learned early how to bite around the tough spots, how to press stew into the bread to soften it, how to gnaw through crust without cracking a tooth. The trencher taught patience and respect. You couldn't eat it quickly. You had to work for it, you had to wait. And in waiting, you learned something about the rhythm of meals, about making do, about saving what others tossed aside, about scraping flavour from the very thing others used as a plate. And so it became more than bread. It became a habit, a symbol, a quiet understanding shared across centuries, that food and tools, labour and hunger, could all exist in one small square slab. But that leaves a thought hanging in the air. If the trencher started as a plate and ended as a meal, did people even notice where the line between utility and food had vanished? Once the stew cooled and the table fell quiet, the trencher stayed behind like a silent witness. Half-eaten, soggy at the centre, torn along the edges, you could see where the grease had soaked through, forming dark blotches in the shape of spoonfuls. You could see the little indent where a thumb had pressed too hard while breaking a crust. If the meal had been meagre, the trencher remained mostly intact. If the stew had been rich, the bread was a wet mess of soft crumb and meat-soaked corners. Either way, it still held value. No one pushed it aside lightly. The brilliance of the trencher lay in its simplicity. A plate that was edible, a slice of bread that was both base and vessel. It turned food into structure and structure back into food. There were no dishes to wash, no tableware to polish. No one worried about broken crockery or tarnished silver. The trencher absorbed the mess and became part of the meal. You could carry it in your hand, eat from it on your lap, or wipe it down with the last of the broth and chew your way through the bottom. In the fields, labourers carried trenchers wrapped in cloth, a hunk of cheese, a piece of cured meat, and a slab of hardened bread. The bread held everything. There was no need for plates or knives. You simply unwrapped it and began. One edge served as the surface, the rest you slowly ate as you worked your way down. When it rained, the cloth kept it dry. When you finished, there was nothing left to carry home but crumbs. In towns and taverns, trenchers were stacked behind counters like the bowls of today. They were made in bulk, shaped and hardened in advance, and served alongside every meal. The barmaid brought you ale and a trencher. The cook ladled stew into its centre. You ate until you could no longer scrape any more with your spoon, then turned the thing in your hands, tearing off one soft corner at a time. If you had teeth, you bit into it. If you didn't, you soaked it in broth until it dissolved. The nobility refined the practice but didn't abandon it. Their trenchers were cut from finer loaves, white bread if they could afford it, made with sifted wheat flour and eggs, baked fresh but hardened intentionally, not to be eaten necessarily, but to serve. The trencher at a noble's feast was thicker, cleaner, more symmetrical. It might be embossed with a house crest or served on a wooden tray beneath, but in the end it did the same job, held the food and caught the juices. The waste of trenchers at noble tables was both practical and performative. To discard a bread plate suggested abundance, wealth, the ability to eat and leave food behind without consequence. But even this waste had a system. Trencher baskets were collected, not for the trash heap but for redistribution. Monasteries gathered them, servants carried them to the kitchen yard. They were crumbled into mash for animals, dried for future meals, or given to beggars at the gate who were more than willing to eat what had once served as someone else's plate. The social message was clear. Trenchers tied all classes together. They were the common thread between peasants, merchants, monks, and lords. Everyone ate from bread. The difference lay only in how fresh, how soft, how round the edges remained. And still the function never changed. The trencher was a platform, a sponge, a final course. It was the boundary between table and meal, and sometimes between you and hunger. Because even if the stew was gone, even if the meat had been scraped clean, there was still the trencher, soaked, sour, savoury, still edible, still warm from the pot, still enough. But this leads to a quiet realisation. When the plate is also the last bite of the meal, did eating ever truly end? By the time the trencher reached the end of its usefulness, it had already absorbed half the meal. The broth had softened its core, the meat had stained its crust, and fingers had torn the corners with slow determination. What began as a base had transformed into a record of everything the table had held. You could read the meal in the bread, the spot where gravy had pooled, the mark of a spoon that had pressed too hard, a crust broken and shared piece by piece until only a damp slab remained. It sat heavy in the hand. Not crisp, not fresh, just dense and warm. It smelled of onions and pepper, of pork fat and barley. You turned it over, thumbed the underside, considered it. Was it worth eating? If you were rich, maybe not. If you were a servant, maybe so. And if you were poor, there was no question. You ate it. The outer crust was still tough, but the centre was soft, spongy from broth, flavoured by everything it had touched. Some said this was the best part of the meal. The bread that came last, soaked with everything that had come before. It was richer than the stew, more satisfying than the meat. It held flavour that couldn't be cooked into anything else. You didn't need a second helping when the plate itself was edible, and in that there was a kind of quiet brilliance, Because in a time when waste was dangerous and plates were a luxury, the trencher solved both problems. You didn't scrape it, you didn't wash it, you didn't store it for tomorrow, you simply consumed it, or passed it on. It had done its job. And then it became food. The cycle was complete. Even in monasteries, where rules governed every aspect of life, the trencher was treated with respect. Monks ate in silence, heads bowed, hands steady. Each brother had his trencher, and if he was full, he offered the rest to the one beside him. Bread was too sacred to waste. To leave a trencher untouched was to insult the labour that had made it, the hands that kneaded, the fire that baked, the grain that grew through winter frost. So you ate, slowly and with reverence, until the last bite was gone. The dog in the corner knew to wait. So did the poor at the gate. What was left behind was never truly discarded. It was absorbed back into the system, back into the stomach, back into the soil when salt scraps were tossed to pigs. In that way, the trencher wasn't just a tool, it was a philosophy. Make it once, use it twice, eat it last. A medieval kitchen might have only a few knives and a single pot, but it had dozens of trenchers, stacked, wrapped, dried, hardened, ready to become plates, ready to become dinner. And in every home, from castle to cottage, that same quiet rhythm unfolded. Pour the stew, tear the bread, dip and chew, pass what remains. And when the meal is done and the bowl is empty and the hunger has faded just a little, you take the plate in both hands and you eat it. It was passed without pause, from hand to hand, bowl to bowl, mouth to mouth. The spoon wasn't yours, it was ours, and you didn't think twice about using it just after someone else had. That's simply how eating worked. In homes where a family might share one pot, one knife, one stool, why wouldn't they share one spoon too? It wasn't a matter of preference, it was necessity. Most households didn't own enough spoons for everyone to have their own. Metal ones were expensive, often reserved for travel or gifted on special occasions. Wooden ones were more common, whittled by hand but still limited. One for the eldest, one for the servant who cooked. Maybe one for the guest if you had the grace to offer. Children often went without. They used their hands or waited for a turn. In mealtime rituals, the spoon floated freely. It stirred the pot, tasted the broth, then landed in the first waiting hand. A mouthful was taken, then another passed along. The next person dipped it back into the same bowl, tasting what remained. There were no separate portion, no double dipping rules. The bowl was shared, the spoon was shared, and so was everything else, spit included. That too was understood, because spit wasn't considered a contaminant. It was just part of life. You saw it when someone tore bread with their teeth and passed the rest on. You heard it in the slurp of stew taken from the rim of a cup just used by someone else. You wiped your mouth on your sleeve, not because you were ashamed, but because there were no napkins. Cleanliness was second to convenience, and convenience was shaped by scarcity. If someone chewed too loudly or licked the spoon before handing it off, you might give them a look, but that was the end of it. No one refused to eat because of germs. Germs didn't exist yet. Not in thought, not in language. Illness came from bad air or bad luck or the judgment of saints, not from a cousin's backwash. Even in wealthier homes where spoons were more plentiful, sharing was still common. At a long table you might have one for every 2 diners, or less if the kitchen was short. Servants cleaned them between courses with a cloth dampened in wine or water, but that cleaning was more symbolic than effective. A quick wipe, a flick of the wrist, back into the bowl. If someone important was present, a priest, a noble, a guest, you might offer them their own. But that spoon had likely been used at the last meal by someone else. It had been rinsed, maybe scraped clean with a bit of sand or ash, but rarely boiled. You polished it with a sleeve, held it with pride, and hoped it wouldn't splinter mid-bite. The children, of course, shared the most. They licked what others left behind, scraped porridge from the edges, sucked broth from hollow crusts. If one child dropped a spoon, another picked it up. If one used it and set it down, the next took it without thinking. Because food came first. Always. And manners, like spoons, were flexible. It wasn't disgusting. It was familiar. You saw the same mouths each day. You sat beside them. You passed the bread. You dipped your spoon where theirs had gone before. And no one flinched. Because flinching meant privilege. And privilege was something most people didn't have the room to carry. Not between hunger and habit. Still, this raises a quiet, strange question. If no one thought to avoid another's mouth, how did they decide where the meal ended and the body of the other began? Once the bowl was placed between them, there was no hesitation. A single spoon, sometimes two, passed back and forth like a quiet rhythm between mouths. There were no announcements, no instructions, just an understanding built on repetition. You took a bite, wiped your lips with your wrist, and passed the spoon without looking. The next person did the same. The pattern was smooth, unspoken, and oddly graceful. Mealtimes weren't long. The food cooled fast, and hands worked faster. You didn't waste time wondering who had used the spoon last. You didn't ask if it had been rinsed. You took your turn and made space for the next. The mouthfuls weren't big, but they were meaningful. Each one was a pause in the day's labour, a reward for patience, a way to mark that you were still alive and still part of the household. The shared spoon wasn't just a compromise, it was a bond. You could trust someone with your breath and your hunger, but trusting them with your spoon was different. It meant something. It said, we are close enough that what you carry, I carry. It wasn't love, it wasn't always kindness, but it was proximity, the kind that mattered when everything else was uncertain. You didn't always know where your next meal would come from, but you knew whose hand would pass the spoon. And that familiarity brought a kind of comfort. The broth was thin, often just barley water with a handful of vegetables, but when you tasted it after someone else, it carried more than flavour. It carried warmth. It had been in a mouth before yours, someone you worked beside, prayed beside, woke up next to on a rush-stuffed pallet. And that made it real. Not clean, no, but deeply human. In the monasteries it was no different. Brothers ate in longyodel, sharing bowls, passing spoons with solemn efficiency. Even here, where rules governed posture and breath, the spoon was still shared. It wasn't about purity, it was about humility. To take what another had touched without complaint was a form of spiritual discipline. And for the youngest brothers, it was a reminder that their mouths were no more precious than those that came before. Children adapted early. They learned to wait. They learned to dip from the side, not the centre. They knew when it was their turn without being told. They didn't complain about the spoon being wet or the bowl already half empty. These things were expected. Their role wasn't to question the spoon, they simply passed it on. In noble homes there were more spoons, more hands to polish them, more servants to carry them away and pretend each one was fresh. But even here the illusion was thin. Guests still dipped from the same sources. Wine goblets were passed, spoons were laid out and then quietly retrieved for the next course. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew nothing truly belonged to just one mouth. And outside the dining hall, in taverns and roadside kitchens, the same scene repeated itself. A wooden spoon, a single bowl of pottage, 3 travellers, 1 hunger. No one flinched when it came their turn. They swallowed, sighed, and passed it on. Because to eat with others was to accept them, their labour, their breath, their unwashed hands and cracked lips and crooked teeth. You didn't eat after someone, you ate with them. And if that meant taking in more than just food, if that meant saliva or cough or a trace of ale still on the rim, then so be it. Because the meal was too precious to pause, and too short to separate your mouth from theirs. But that leaves one thought, still lingering. If the spoon never truly left the circle, did the body ever stop being part of the meal? By the time the pot was nearly empty, the spoon moved slower. Not from caution, but from custom. There was an understanding whoever took the last scoop didn't do it in silence. You nodded. You offered. You asked with a glance, even if no one answered. Taking the final bite meant carrying the last taste of everyone else who had dipped before you. Their breath, their hunger, their saliva steeped into that final spoonful like one last ingredient. It wasn't seen as dirty. It was just honest. You ate together, so you finished together. When the bowl was scraped clean, the spoon was set on the board. Sticky, warm, often licked once more before being wiped on a sleeve or cloth. No one rushed to clean it. That came later, if at all. In some homes, it was tossed back into the pot, left to soak until someone remembered it. In others, it was handed to the youngest, whose job it was to rinse it in cold water from the basin or the barrel out back. Soap was optional. Ash and elbow grease were more common. And if there was no time to wash it, well, it would be used again anyway. The next meal was only a few hours away. Wooden spoons were tough and familiar. They soaked in the smell of the hearth and the sour tang of stewed cabbage. They bent slightly over time, wore smooth in the middle, and darkened with use. You didn't throw them out unless they split. Even then the handle might be carved into something else. They were carved from the same trees that shaded the pasture. passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from cook to child, from stranger to stranger. Some families had a good spoon, kept polished, stored in a drawer or wrapped in cloth, used for guests or holy days, but most used what was close, and close often meant shared. The same spoon that stirred the pot at sunrise would pass through 5 mouths by sunset. The same one that tasted the broth would ladle it into bowls and scrape the bottom when the pot grew thin. There was no line between what was clean and what was used. It had all been used, it had all been touched, and no one complained. Complaining about the spoon was like complaining about the weather. Pointless, undignified, a waste of energy in a world where energy was needed for other things, like chopping wood, hauling water, kneading dough. Better to keep quiet and chew. Even during sickness, the spoon didn't disappear. Maybe someone used a cup instead. Maybe they took their meal near the hearth while others sat at the table. But the spoon itself wasn't blamed. Illness came from within, or from the devil or the wind, not from wood. And even if it had come from the spoon, what then? You needed it. You used it anyway. You passed it again just as someone had passed it to you. Because the spoon wasn't about just safety. It was about sharing. It was a symbol of the meal itself, passed or reused, never fully yours and always a little damp. It wasn't sanitary, it was a human. It tasted like onions and broth and old wood and breath. And somehow, despite everything, it made you feel full. Not just in the belly, but in the sense that you belonged. To the pot, to the table, to the hands that reached for the spoon before and after you. So you passed it again. And the circle never really broke. You didn't feed the dog under the table. You fed it at the table. Not out of affection, not because it was trained or deserved it, but because the dog was simply there. Every day, every meal, just another creature waiting for scraps like everyone else. And no one thought much of it. In a medieval household, the dog didn't live in the kennel. It lived in the kitchen, in the hall, on the hearth. And when food appeared, it came close-nosed around the benches and waited for its moment. There was no separation of species when it came to hunger. People didn't see animals the way we do now. They weren't companions or pets in the sentimental sense. They were useful, practical, and also persistent. The dog barked when strangers approached. It guarded the chickens, it slept at the door. And when the stew hit the table, it leaned against someone's knee, tail thumping, eyes watching the bread bowl like a parishioner watching the altar. It knew the rhythm of the meal. It knew that sooner or later something would fall, and it didn't have to wait long. Trenchers soaked through with grease were tossed to the floor. Crumbs swept off the board landed in open jaws. Bones, gnawed to the marrow, were flung to the shadows where the dog waited without a sound. A careless elbow sent half a boiled root spinning to the corner. A child turned their head, and the dog took what was left from their lap. And no one minded. Not really. The dog earned its keep. And even if it didn't, who would waste a scrap? That was the unspoken rule of the medieval table, waste nothing. And if you weren't going to eat it, the dog would. It wasn't unusual for a hound to lick a bowl clean after a meal. In poorer homes, that was the clean-up. You wiped the edge with a rag, let the dog lap at what was left, then stacked it on the shelf. No soap, no boiling water, just a tongue and a breeze. The bowl dried. It was used again. Even in noble halls where servants lit candles and roasts were carved with ceremony, dogs were part of the dining scene. Big dogs, lean, alert, bred for hunting, lay beside the master's bench, heads on paws, twitching at every movement. They watched as venison was sliced, as gravy pooled, as hands reached for wine. And when no one was looking, they received their share. Sometimes they were fed directly, scraps flicked from the hand, meat offered from fingers still wet with juice, a sign of favour perhaps, or just habit, because the dog had always been there. People didn't complain, not even when a wet nose nudged a thigh or a snort rattled the bench or a tongue found the underside of a plate. It was expected, part of the meal. If anything, it added to the sense that the table was alive, that the food had gravity, and all things hungry would eventually find their way to it. Children learned early not to compete with the dog. You held your crust tight, you watched the floor, you didn't cry if the hound licked your hand before you dipped your bread, because someone else already had. The line between human and animal was blurry at the table. The meal didn't belong to any one person, it belonged to the household, to the people, to the animals, to the walls that held the heat in. The food travelled down the chain, from pot to bowl, from hand to mouth, from mouth to floor, and the dog was just waiting for its turn. But that raises a simple, unsettling thought. If the dog shared your dinner, your table, your bowl, how far did the meal stretch before it stopped being yours at all? You didn't call the dog by name, not always. It had one, probably, but you used it like you used everything else in the house, only when necessary. Most of the time it was just him or her, or a whistle from the side of your mouth. The dog knew when it was needed and when it wasn't. And during meals it was never far. It didn't beg, it waited, not with discipline, but with confidence. Because in a medieval home, food was not something portioned out in clean lines. It arrived in pots and bowls, overflowing, unpredictable, shared between hands and mouths and sleeves. There was no pretense of sterility, no promise that every bite was only yours. The dog was simply part of that flow. It curled beneath the bench, sat beside the hearth, leaned gently on a child's leg or rested its head on the bare foot of an elder. It didn't growl, it didn't snatch unless taught to, it only watched. And when the time was right, when a trencher slid too far to one side or a bone was set down without attention, it acted, and no one scolded it. Because the dog was part of the household economy, you fed it what you couldn't use, the bone with no marrow, the crust gone too hard, the stew bottom that had grown bitter, the skin from the fat cap of a joint. In this way nothing was wasted. The dog was a walking trash bin, a cleaner of the floor, a quiet assurance that no scrap would ever go to waste. In winter this was even more true. Meat spoiled slowly in the cold, but nothing was ever quite fresh. The dog could smell what you couldn't, and sometimes what it rejected was not eaten. People watched that. If the dog sniffed and turned away, maybe the stew stayed in the pot one more day. If it licked the plate clean, you knew the meat was still good. The dog wasn't just fed, it was consulted. In noble houses, the relationship was more assigned but no less intimate. The lord's hound might sit behind his chair, sleek, brushed, trained to heel, but it still got fed. A chunk of veal flicked backward, a hand reaching down with fingers slick with butter. No one remarked. It was the same gesture a stable boy might make in a peasant hut, with a thinner cut of meat perhaps, and a rougher hand, but the impulse was identical. To eat was to share was to include. And the dog, for all its fur and teeth and damp breath, was not an outsider. It was part of the meal. In some places the dog was even expected to finish what others couldn't. A half-gnawed bone, a bit of pottage gone cold, bread too wet from broth. You gave it over, not as a gift, but as a gesture of rhythm. The food moved down the line, from the pot to the plate to the child to the dog, from hunger to satisfaction to buttons. And in that silence the dog chewed, and no one watched, because that was the point. You didn't eat to admire, you ate to survive, and the dog helped make sure nothing got in the way of that. Still, you have to wonder, when even the scraps had structure and even the animal had its place, did the food ever really end at the table? The dog was still licking the floor long after the rest had stood up. The hearth was cooling, the bowls stacked, the last heel of bread wrapped in cloth and set aside. Someone might kick a stray bone closer to the wall. Someone else might flick a bit of meat skin from the bench with the back of their hand, and the dog, patient, quiet, ever-present, cleaned it all without needing to be told. The table, such as it was, had served the entire house, and the dog was part of that house. This wasn't sentiment. No one was calling the hound a family member. No one tucked it in or carved its name on the wall. But it was part of the daily rhythm, just as necessary, just as trusted. It moved through the kitchen like smoke, appearing when the pot was stirred, reappearing when the trencher was passed, rising at the scrape of a knife or the clatter of a wooden bowl hitting the floor. It knew the sound of supper, the way it knew the sound of thunder, and when it came near. No one saw this as unclean. There was no disgust when the dog's snout reached the edge of a chair, no pause when it licked a dropped spoon, no revulsion when it sniffed at a plate someone was still eating from. If anything, there was comfort in its presence. Its hunger mirrored your own. Its place at the table, though lower, was equally earned, because everything in the house earned its way. You worked, you waited, you watched, and when food came you took what you were given. That rule didn't change just because you walked on 4 legs. In fact, the dog was often more reliable than the people. It didn't steal, it didn't push, it didn't interrupt, it simply waited. And that made it welcome. In spring it cleaned up what was left from salted meats and dried root stews. In summer it chased flies from the kitchen and snapped at bones tossed from the window. In autumn, when slaughter came and the blood ran into barrels, It circled the butchering bench, catching what fell. In winter, it curled at the foot of the bed, belly full of crusts and grease, guarding the door with breath like smoke. And in every season, at every meal, it reminded you wordlessly that food was not a solitary thing. It was shared, not just among the people, but among everything that lived and waited and remembered. And when a new child came to the table, barefoot, wide-eyed, unsure, they learned quickly that the food was not theirs alone. The table was crowded, hands and bowls and mouths and dogs, and in that crowding there was order. A plate was never scraped so clean as when a hound waited below it. And hunger was never quite so soft as when it sat beside a warm, patient body who asked for nothing but what you had to give. So you gave, because someone once gave to you, and no bite of meat or bit of crust ever really left the house. It just found a new mouth. And that, in the end, was what dinner really meant. Washing before a meal wasn't a rule, it was a rare event. A gesture reserved for holidays, guests, or death. More often than not, the hands that reached for the bread were the same hands that had shot a horse, hauled a sack of turnips, or emptied a chamber pot an hour earlier. And no one blinked, no one asked for soap, because in a world where everything smelled of soil, ash, or salted meat, the idea of eating with clean hands simply didn't fit. There were basins, yes, shallow wooden or metal bowls placed on stools near the hearth or beside the outer door. Some homes had them, some didn't, and even when water was poured into them, it was reused, cloudy from the last pair of hands, still warm from the person before you. Sometimes it was scented with herbs if a feast was being prepared. Sometimes a sprig of rosemary floated on top, more symbolic than effective. But most days the basin sat dry. The bucket hadn't been fetched. The well was too far, the fire had taken priority. So people wiped their hands instead. On aprons, on hay, on the edges of their tunics. Or not at all. A little dirt never stopped dinner. It clung beneath the nails and sat in the lines of the palm. It smelled like the yard or the field or the forge, but it didn't stop fingers from tearing meat or scooping porridge. Clean was a matter of appearance, not sanitation. If your hands didn't look too filthy, that was enough. Soap, when it existed, was precious. Made with animal fat and lye, it was gritty, rough, and rarely used outside of laundry. A bar of soap was a household tool, not a personal one. It was used on stains, on the floor, on linens soaked in hot water, but not on your hands before a meal. That would have been considered wasteful, or even strange. If someone did wash before eating, it was noted. Where are you going with that water? Why are your sleeves rolled? Did something happen? And sometimes something had. Washing your hands before supper might mean someone had died, a ritual cleansing, a sign of mourning. The water poured slowly over both hands while prayers were mumbled, and the bowl was emptied toward the garden or the fire. That kind of washing carried weight. It wasn't hygiene, it was grief, which made daily meals all the more casual. You arrived with what you had on you. Mud on your boots, soot on your wrist, a scratch from hauling wood. None of it mattered once the food was ready. You sat, you dipped, you tore, you chewed. You wiped your fingers between bites if the stew was greasy. You licked them clean if it wasn't. The idea of separating yourself from your work before eating would have been puzzling. Why would you pretend your hands hadn't earned the meal? Why would you wash away the effort? Better to eat while the calluses were still warm and the dirt still real. Better to carry the day's labour straight to the table and make no apology for it. But that brings a quiet question to the surface. If washing meant something ceremonial, almost sacred, what did it say that people only did it when death had touched the house? Meals weren't preceded by ritual, they were the ritual. The clatter of bowls, the smell of boiled onions, the hiss of something frying in lard over the fire, these were the sounds that gathered a household. You didn't need a bell. The scent of food was enough, and as people found their places, wiping their hands on their hips, adjusting their cloaks or smoothing their skirts, the idea of washing up didn't even cross most minds. It wasn't because people were filthy on purpose, it's just that cleanliness as we define it now didn't really exist. The hand you extended toward the bread had spent the morning holding a scythe, tying flax or tugging at a stubborn hinge on the door. The fingernail pressed against your trencher's crust had a rim of soot or garden soil under it. And the palm you used to wipe your mouth midway through a hot spoonful of barley stew smelled faintly of the stable. It was all part of the meal. You didn't wash your hands before dinner because there was no expectation that your hands were unclean in the first place. They were used. That was the difference. And if they looked a little darkened, a little dry, maybe chipped at the knuckles. That was proof you belonged at the table. In noble households, things looked more refined, but weren't all that different underneath. A basin might be brought forward for hand-washing before a feast, but only when guests were present. A servant might pour warm water scented with rose oil or bay over your fingers. A linen towel would be offered, folded neatly. You'd dip your hands in, flick them dry, wipe once, and be done. It was not about thoroughness. It was about showing that washing had occurred. The ceremony mattered more than the soap. Even then, no one believed that this made the food safer. It simply made it feel more civilized. But in most homes, even those small moments were absent. Children came in from play, cheeks flushed, hands sticky from sap or dirt, and sat straight down. No one paused. If anything, a parent might swap the back of a neck, not for being unwashed, but for being loud. You were expected to settle down, not clean up. The idea of scrubbing before every meal would have sounded absurd. The firewood needed stacking. The goat needed milking. There were mushrooms to sort. Who had time to wash for stew? And besides, most people only truly washed once a week. On Saturday, if the weather was good and the water could be warmed. Then the big tub was brought in. Water was hauled in pots and buckets, ladled carefully from the well. The first to bathe was usually the eldest or the most honoured. By the time the youngest got in, the water was cloudy and lukewarm, and still considered a blessing. That was cleanliness. That was effort. You didn't waste it on something that would just get your hands dirty again 5 minutes later. And yet, when someone died, the bowl came out. Not for food, for the ritual. You poured water over your hands before breaking bread that night. It wasn't about germs. It was about acknowledging absence. The body was gone, but the meal continued, and before you could take part in it again, you washed. That moment of pause made the act meaningful, but on ordinary days, the grease on your hands was part of the story. It told of work done, it flavoured the crust, it softened the callus, and if it left a smear on your wooden spoon, so be it. You didn't eat with clean hands, you ate with honest ones. Which leads to a simple question, one that lingers across centuries. When did clean hands begin to mean respect, and stop meaning you'd been working? The water sat untouched, in the basin near the door, in the bucket beside the hearth. Someone might swirl their fingers in it as they passed by, but no one poured it with intention. No one lathered their hands, no one paused long enough to think, should I be clean before I eat? Because that wasn't the rhythm of the day. That wasn't how meals worked. You finished your work, you wiped your palms on your thighs, and you sat. To break that rhythm, to stop, wash and return would have felt like vanity, like stepping out of the world everyone else was still living in. So you didn't. You came to the table the way you were, calloused, chapped, soot on your wrist, straw in your hair, dirt in the folds of your knuckles. No one minded. No one remarked, because everyone else looked the same, and the food was already cooling. Bread didn't wait. Pottage didn't hold its heat forever, and the fire was only so strong today. So you dipped your hand into the bowl, tore from the edge of the trencher, and wiped the stew from your lip with the back of your wrist. Maybe you licked your fingers, maybe you wiped them on your apron, but you didn't rise again until the meal was done. Even in monasteries, where structure and cleanliness were upheld more strictly, washing was measured out like a ritual, not a habit. You washed before prayer, you washed on feast days, you washed after touching the dead. But before supper, only if ceremony called for it. A silent meal with 50 brothers might involve a single bowl of warm water passed between them, shared, reverent, quick, hands lowered into it one by one, not scrubbed but acknowledged. And still it was more for the soul than the stomach. You were cleansing your place in the order of things, not your fingertips. The truth was simple. Washing was rare, because the need was not defined by health but by context. If you smelled too strongly, someone might hand you herbs to rub on your skin. If your nails were blackened past what was tolerable, you might scrape them clean. But your hands, they were working hands, eating hands, lived-in hands. You used them to stitch, plant, grind, carry, sweep, pull, knead, and eventually eat. And if they were lined with grit, who cared? The food would disappear just the same. And besides, you weren't the only one dipping into the pot. The person beside you had done the same, so had the child before you, so had the neighbour who borrowed salt this morning and now shared your bread without a word. Clean wasn't the concern, enough was, warmth was, company was, whether there was meat in the stew was, but not the state of your hands, so they stayed as they were, honest, cracked, tired, and welcome at the table, Because if you were there, still breathing, still upright, still chewing, you'd done enough to earn your place, and that was all the washing anyone required. You didn't ask for a napkin, not because there weren't any, but because no one expected one. Cloth was valuable, often coarse, and meant for things more pressing than wiping stew off your fingers. If you needed to clean your hands at the table, you used what was closest: your tunic, your sleeve, the back of your hand, or occasionally someone else's. That wasn't rudeness. That was dinner. In the medieval world, meals were messy affairs. Bread torn with fingers, pottage slurped from bowls, grease clinging to lips and knuckles. Meat was fatty, boiled soft, and eaten with your hands. You wiped instinctively, without thinking, on your apron, your forearm, your knee. And when cloth wasn't available, you used straw from the floor or the rough hem of someone else's garment, if they were close enough and didn't mind. No one flinched. No one paused to scold. A hand on your shoulder, a smudge left behind, a streak of fat pressed into your elbow. These weren't insults. They were the rhythms of mealtime in a world that didn't separate eating from everything else. Your clothes were working clothes. Your body was an extension of your labour. If it caught a smear of gravy or a bit of bread crust, so be it. In smaller homes, where space was tight and families sat shoulder to shoulder, hands reached across arms and laps without permission. A swipe here, a pat there, a soft curse when something hot dripped down the wrist. You might wipe your fingers on your mother's apron or your brother's tunic. You might find someone else's mark already there: dried grease, a thumbprint of mustard, the edge of a stew stain. It didn't matter. The cloth would be worn again tomorrow, stained or not. Napkins, when they did appear, were reserved for occasions. A folded square of linen laid beside a trencher at a feast. A servant might offer one, dampened and sweet-smelling, to a noble after the final course. But even then, it was for show. The real cleaning had already been done, on wood, on skin, on whatever part of the table you could reach when the juices ran too far. There were no rules about who could wipe and where. Children wiped on adults, servants wiped on aprons, brothers wiped on sisters, with a shrug or a laugh. Even in monasteries, where order was sacred and silence was law, sleeves bore the quiet stains of soup and wine. The habit was too long, too close to the bowl, too likely to patch what tea dripped. You learned to live with it. Some monks folded napkins into their sleeves, but more often they just wiped and moved on. People didn't try to stay clean. They tried to stay fed, and cleaning came afterward, if there was water, if there was time. Until then, your skin carried the story of the meal, so did your clothes. A bit of fat at the collar, a trail of stew down the front, a crust of bread tucked into the cuff, and if you leaned too close to someone during supper, you might come away with a mark of their dinner too. It was never personal, just proof that you'd eaten together. But that raises a curious thought. If the body became the napkin, and the cloth became the history, did the meal ever really end, or did it simply stay with you? By the middle of the meal, the table was already a mess. Breadcrumbs scattered like hay across the boards. Thin rivulets of broth traced their way around the edges of trenchers. A bit of spilled ale soaked into someone's sleeve. The dog had knocked a bone aside with its tail, and no one stopped to tidy it. Because tidiness wasn't the point. You came to the table to eat, not to fuss. And so, when your fingers were slick, or sticky, or covered in fat, you used what was close: your sleeve, your apron, your thigh, or someone else's. It wasn't disrespect, it was trust. A hand braced on a shoulder while tearing meat. Fingers wiped on the hem of a friend's tunic without apology. A child leaned against a parent, mouth full, hands wet, and no one pushed them away. There was no barrier between the body and the table. Everything was a surface. Everything was shared. A leg became a napkin, a tunic a towel. The edge of the table became a place to wipe your palm before reaching for more bread. Because the table itself wasn't clean either. There was no expectation that it should be. It was often just a plank of wood set on barrels or trestles. It had grooves worn from knives, patches dark with old spills. In some houses, it was scrubbed now and then with vinegar or sand, but in many, it was simply used. Food fell, hands scraped, bones rolled, and the mess of one meal was often pushed aside to make room for the next. In wealthier homes, cloths were laid down, but they soaked through ale, grease, red wine, beetroot. The linen turned brown before the course ended. By the time it was lifted, it bore the record of the meal more vividly than memory. And people bore it too. Clothes caught everything. If you sat close to the stew, you wore its scent all evening. If you helped serve, your cuffs showed it. If someone beside you wiped their fingers on your back, well, that was just part of the evening. There was a comfort in that, an intimacy that modern cleanliness would find unacceptable, but medieval life treated as normal. You didn't apologise. You laughed maybe, or grunted, or didn't notice, because wiping your hands on someone else wasn't rude. It was real. It meant you were there, together, surviving, eating with your whole body engaged, fingers, arms, face, belly. And when the meal ended, there was no ceremony to clean. You got up, brushed off what you could, and moved on. The tunic would dry, the grease would stiffen, the smell would fade or become part of you. It wasn't filth, it was evidence that you had eaten, that you had been fed, that someone had passed you the bread, and you had wiped your fingers on their sleeve. And they hadn't minded, because that's what people did. And in a world where survival depended on sharing everything, meals, tools, space, a bit of sauce on someone else's cuff was hardly cause for concern. So perhaps that leaves us with a question, centuries later. When did food stop being something that touched everyone, and start being something no one wanted to feel? By the time the meal was over, you could trace the food not just by smell or memory, but by marks. A streak of fat across your sleeve, a thumbprint of berry juice on someone else's collar, the rough shine of dried gravy across your apron, where 3 different hands had wiped in passing. The evidence of eating clung to everyone, like smoke clings to wool. It wasn't accidental, it was expected, and no one minded. Because in that messiness, on skin, on cloth, on the edge of the bench, was the proof that something had been shared. Not just food, but space, time, company. The table wasn't an island of manners. It was a gathering ground for survival, and everyone who sat there knew. To eat together meant to touch, to pass, to press fingers and elbows and knees into one another's space until the meal became a single, unbroken gesture. There was no thought of individual portions, no napkins folded neatly in laps, no warm cloth offered between courses. The grease went where the grease went, the stew dripped where the spoon pointed, and the hands, always the hands, reached for what they needed and left their trace behind. If a shirt bore the mark of butter, it wasn't ruined. It was worn again the next day. The mark would dry, fade, join the others, proof that the person who wore it had eaten. And in a time where hunger never lingered far from the door, that was something to be proud of. In the winter, when fat was scarce and meals were thinner, the presence of a stain meant richness. That spot on your shoulder, that meant there had been pork. That bit of dark brown on your sleeve, that meant gravy. You wore your meals long after they were gone. The scent of garlic or onion rose from cuffs, from scarves, from the folds of an old tunic. It didn't make you less clean. It made you real. Even the dogs knew it. They sniffed your clothes long after the bowl had been emptied. They followed the trail of your dinner, nose pressed to a patch of fabric that had caught a bit of meat juice or barley mush. You might brush them off or offer the tunic later for a chew. It didn't matter. The food had left the bowl but not the house. And even among friends the signs remained. Someone would grin at the smear on your chest. You'd notice a mark on their sleeve that looked like jam, though neither of you had eaten jam in weeks. These weren't embarrassments. They were small reminders. Of having enough. Of being close. Of not eating alone. Because nothing at that table was separate. Not the people, not the food, not the stains it left behind. And so when you wiped your hand on your neighbour's tunic, they didn't flinch. They just passed you the bread. And you wiped your mouth with the same cloth you'd used yesterday, and the day before that, and it was still damp with broth that had been shared by everyone. The cleaning came later. Or maybe it didn't. Because the point wasn't to stay clean. It was to stay full. To stay warm. To stay together. To carry the meal forward even after it was gone. So if you smelled of onions, if your sleeves shone with stew, if the front of your tunic bore the memory of the hearth, you didn't change. You sat back. You licked the corner of your mouth, and you let the meal stay with you. Because no one else at that table would expect you to be clean. Only fed. It slid onto the plate with a sound somewhere between a thud and a sigh. A boiled onion, whole, translucent, barely holding its shape. It had been simmering for hours in salted water or weak broth, softened until it gave way beneath the side of a spoon. It wasn't a delicacy, it wasn't a centerpiece. But in many households it was dinner. There was no garnish, no sauce, no attempt to disguise what it was. The skin had been peeled, the ends trimmed, and into the pot it had gone. And when it emerged, pale and steaming, it was greeted not with complaint, but with quiet gratitude. Because a boiled onion meant something warm. It meant something that had weight, something that could be chewed. In a world where food wasn't always guaranteed, A soft onion was something to hold on to, and it was considered clean. That's the word people used. Not because it was washed or served on polished crockery, but because it was pure, boiled, softened, reduced to its essence. The fire had tamed it. The water had thinned it. Whatever grit clung to it from the garden had been washed away in the pot. Compared to dry bread or hard roots scraped raw, the onion felt luxurious. When meals were thin, when the pantry held only scraps of barley and the garden had gone to frost, a boiled onion was a balm. It made the broth sweet. It gave the pot something to centre around. It filled the belly in a way dry food never could. And it was familiar. Everyone had seen one. Everyone knew what it tasted like. It didn't surprise or offend, and so it passed for something better. For cleanliness, for refinement, even when everything else on the table was falling apart. In some households, the onion was the only thing served warm. Bread might be cold, cheese was hard, ale flat. But the onion, that came from the pot, steam still rising, soft enough to mash, wet enough to coat your tongue. You didn't need a knife, you didn't even need teeth, it fell apart in your mouth like a kindness. And when you were lucky, there was fat. A bit of dripping stirred into the broth, a trace of lard clinging to the pot, something to coat the onion in, something that made it shimmer. That shimmer was important. It meant someone had tried, had taken the time to turn a simple root into something resembling care. And care at the table was rare. Because meals weren't measured by etiquette. They were measured by presence, by temperature, by how far the food had to travel to reach your mouth. And a boiled onion, steaming in the centre of the table, needed no introduction. It was humble. It was quiet. It was warm. And that made it, in its own way, the cleanest thing many people would eat all week. But here's a thought to hold on to. If warmth and softness made a meal feel refined, was cleanliness ever really about hands at all? No one expected the onion to be white. It wasn't peeled with care or trimmed with delicacy. It was hacked at with the same knife used to gut the fish or the trim fat from a salted ham. It was dunked in cold water, maybe scrubbed with a cloth that had already been through 2 days' worth of chores, and tossed straight into the pot. But once boiled, it looked soft, smooth, translucent, gentle almost. And that look, more than anything, was enough to convince people it was clean. The truth was simpler. The onion had been boiled into submission. Boiled long enough, any shape becomes safe. The sharp bite was gone, replaced by sweetness, the fibres loosened. The colour faded, and by the time it reached your bowl, it barely held itself together. The illusion was complete. This wasn't a root from the ground anymore. It was food. Proper food. The kind you could serve to a guest without apology. That mattered. Especially in homes where presentation was usually the last concern. You didn't have platters or silver. You had bowls, hands, and steam. And a boiled onion sitting whole in the centre of the table gave the impression that something wholesome had been prepared. Something clean. Not in the modern sense, but in a way that made people feel they were being looked after. No grit, no bones, no need to chew too hard or pick at a crust, just warmth and a spoon, and something that didn't fight back. It was often fed to the ill, to the elderly with no teeth, to the very young still learning how to eat. Because it went down without resistance. It soothed, it coated the throat, it filled the belly. And in a time where meals could feel like work, gnawing through hard bread, pulling stringy meat from bones, this softness felt like mercy, and mercy was rare. At monasteries, the boiled onion held quiet honour, given on fasting days, slipped into bowls for the weaker brothers, served without fanfare but never ignored. It was food that didn't need explaining. It required no chewing, no cutting, no noise, just a spoon, a small blessing, and a warm swallow. In noble kitchens, it was elevated, basted in broth spiced with pepper or cloves, maybe served atop a trencher brushed with butter. But even there, the gesture was the same. Softness was interpreted as grace, cleanliness, thoughtfulness. You didn't need to scrub a plate if nothing stuck to it, and you didn't need to question what was served if it melted in your mouth. For the poor, the onion carried no performance, just usefulness. It stretched broth, it flavoured old beans, it gave texture to mash. It was cheap, familiar, and always available. And when boiled enough, it felt like something better than what it was, which perhaps is the whole point. In a world without soap where hands were cracked and dishes barely rinsed, texture did the work of illusion. Soft meant boiled. Boiled meant safe. Safe meant clean. And no one looked any closer. But what does that say about the line between comfort and cleanliness? When food feels pure, do we stop needing it to be? By the time the onion hit the bowl, it was more steam than substance. The layers had collapsed inward, softened to the point of shapelessness. It jiggled slightly when touched with a spoon. No sharpness remained. No crunch. Just warmth and the faint sweetness that came from long boiling. And that steam, that rising, fragrant, murmurous mist, was what made people believe, quietly, that what they were eating was good, maybe even clean, because steam meant it had been cooked thoroughly. And in a world where thorough was the closest thing to safety, that was enough. You couldn't see bacteria, you didn't know about microbes, but you did know that boiling something until it went soft made it easier to eat, and harder to blame for what came after. If your stomach twisted, maybe it was the bread, maybe it was the air. But the onion? No. The onion had been tamed, cooked until its very smell had changed. And the smell lingered. It clung to the pot, to the steam in the rafters, to the cloth laid out beside the hearth. It was sharp when raw, but gentle when finished. A transformation people trusted. You could taste the difference, feel it slide down the throat without resistance. It left your mouth feeling coated but not dry. It felt, in a strange way, caring. That was rare for food in those days. Most meals were indifferent, tough, cold, bitter, full of effort. But a boiled onion asked nothing from you. No chewing, no effort, no suspicion, just swallow, and that made it precious. You didn't serve it often, not because it was expensive, but because it was important. You saved it for days when teeth ached, when bellies grumbled more than usual, when the pot had more water than food and you needed something that felt whole. A single onion could turn water into broth, turn a poor man's dinner into something that filled more than the stomach. Children were fed them early, elders asked for them late, and everyone in between knew that when the onion came, something was different. The house was quieter, the meal softer, the tension lowered just slightly. It was food that brought no arguments, no chewing over fairness. Everyone got one, everyone dipped, everyone ate. Even in its quietest form, the onion held the centre. Boiled, broken, barely holding shape, but still the thing people reached for. Still the thing that turned thin broth into something warm. Still the thing that made the table feel like a place worth gathering around. It didn't matter if it was served with fingers or a knife that had cut 3 other things that day. It didn't matter if it was passed from bowl to bowl, spooned out with the same ladle someone had licked the night before. The onion had been boiled. It had steam. And that, for most people, was a kind of salvation. It wasn't hygiene. It wasn't safety. But it was enough. Because in a world without soap, refrigeration or certainty, the sight of something soft and steaming meant, this has been tended to. And when food has been tended to, you trust it. Even if your hands are dirty. Even if your bowl was barely rinsed. Even if the dog licked the ladle that morning. You trust it. And you eat. The cup passed without pause. From hand to hand, from mouth to mouth, without wiping, without washing, without hesitation. It was wood or clay, metal if you were fortunate, and it belonged to no one in particular, not during the meal. At a table where everything was shared, from the trencher to the stew to the dog curled beneath your feet, the cup was simply another part of the circle. It carried ale, watered wine, thin cider, sometimes even plain water if you dared. But no matter the drink, the rules were always the same. You drank, you handed it off, and you never asked where it had just been. Clean wasn't a concern, familiarity was. You knew who'd used it before you. The same hands that had helped dig the trench last week. The same mouth that coughed all morning. The same lips that kissed a turned baby or scolded the dog or sang during morning chores. They drank, and now it was your turn. You took it without blinking. This wasn't politeness, it was practicality. Most households had a few cups at best. The wealthy had more, sure, but even then drink was shared. A single jug, a single goblet passed around the feast table while voices rose and fell in waves of talk and laughter. Servants might bring more, but still they were reused. Rinsed if lucky, wiped on an apron if not, but no one expected anything more. The poor especially shared everything. If there was ale, it came in a jug and was poured sparingly into the same cracked cup. The father drank, then the eldest, then down the line. Sometimes the cup didn't even make it all the way around before it was empty, so you waited. You learned to sip quickly and pass it without complaint. Children understood the system early. They didn't expect their own vessels. They reached when it was offered, tipped it back and passed it along. Even the smallest ones knew not to linger. There was no time for dawdling, no tolerance for pickiness. If you didn't like the rim wet from another mouth, you learned to turn the cup slightly or drink fast. If someone backwashed, well, there'd be another chance tomorrow. In noble settings where silver goblets gleamed and wine flowed from carved pitchers, the ritual was the same at its core. You toasted, you sipped, you passed. Guests shared cups. Drinking together was a symbol of trust, of alliance. It meant you were equals, even if only for the duration of the feast. The idea that someone might refuse a drink because the cup had touched another's lips would have been not just strange, but insulting. Monks drank in silence, but they too passed the same vessel between brothers. 1 cup of ale, 1 cup of watered wine, 1 dip into the communal ladle during supper. It was not luxury, it was unity. Cleanliness came in the form of order, not sanitation. You drank your portion, nodded, and passed it down the line. The mouth was not seen as dangerous. It was just part of the chain, like the spoon, like the hand that served the stew, like the cloth that wiped the table, then wiped the baby's face, and the cup, perhaps more than any of it, symbolized what the table really meant. That you belonged, that your mouth was trusted, that your thirst, like everyone else's, deserved its turn. Which leaves one simple lingering question. If everyone drank from the same cup without hesitation, was the trust in the drink or in each other? You didn't worry about whose lips had touched it before yours. You only cared that it was wet, that the cup had something inside, ale, water, weak wine, cider steeped with herbs, anything to cut the dryness in your throat or chase away the taste of salted meat. It didn't need to be yours. It didn't need to be clean. It just needed to be there. Because thirst wasn't delicate in the Middle Ages, it was persistent. You lived outside, worked outside, sweated, bled, hauled, breathed in dust. And when food came, it was dry. Dense rye bread, cold grains, roasted flesh. Nothing melted in your mouth. Nothing washed itself down. So when the cup came around, you drank. Eagerly, hungrily, even if the rim was slick, even if it tasted faintly of someone else. And sometimes it did. You got used to the trace of another's breath, the warmth still lingering in the metal, the smear of stew across the lip. It was all part of the meal, just like the shared spoon, the greasy trencher, the hand wiping on cloth already soiled. A communal table meant a communal body. What one tasted, another did too. What one carried, all might share. But that didn't stop anyone. Because water was heavy to carry and ale took time to brew. If a cup was in front of you, you used it. If there were 3 cups and 8 people, you waited for your turn and didn't grumble when someone wiped their mouth with the back of their hand and then handed it over. Wiping was optional, some did, most didn't. There were no napkins to dab the rim, just tunics, sleeves, straw. You might turn the cup to sip from a clean edge if you were cautious. You might take the same side as the person before you, trusting that what they'd had you'd already shared in other ways. After all, you'd already eaten from the same bowl, touched the same bread, passed the same knife. Drinking from the same cup was only natural. In the fields, the cup might hang on a peg or sit in the shade of a tree, waiting for each hand to reach it between tasks. On the road, a single flask might be passed between riders, sloshing weak ale that had grown sour in the heat. At the hearth, the jug might sit at the centre of the table, the same ladle dipped again and again into clay mugs that hadn't seen boiling water in weeks. And no one questioned it, because to question was to delay, and thirst didn't like to wait. So people drank. And if they coughed afterward, or spat, or wiped their lips with a grimace, that was part of the rhythm too. What mattered wasn't purity, it was relief. That moment when your throat wasn't dry anymore, when your mouth remembered something other than smoke and salt. When the cup, however past, however wet, finally came to you. And if it brought more than liquid, you didn't speak of it, because thirst was louder than hesitation, and so was custom. Which leaves us to wonder, when your mouth became part of the table, did the cup ever truly belong to anyone at all? By the end of the meal, the cup had passed through 5 mouths, maybe more. No one counted, no one cared. It was back at the start, resting by the edge of the bowl, half drained, a little warm, a little greasy, a few drops of ale pooled at the bottom, flavoured by the air and whatever lips had left behind. But it was still drinkable. That was the only standard that mattered. It didn't belong to anyone, not in the modern sense. The cup was a tool of the household, like the spoon, like the knife, like the trenchers stacked on the shelf, crusted and reused. It was picked up when needed, passed without pause, and returned with no ownership. Even in homes that had more than one, they rarely matched. A bent tin mug, a wooden goblet smoothed from use, A horn cup with the rim chipped, always offered to the youngest. The form didn't matter, the function did. Drinking was a gesture of trust, but it wasn't romantic or sacred, it was instinct. You trusted the person beside you to give you the cup without draining it. You trusted the drink to be fresh enough, the cup to be intact, the passing hand to be steady. And even if none of those were true, you drank anyway. Because refusing the cup was worse than sharing it. To pull back out of fear or distaste was to signal you didn't belong, that you thought yourself better, cleaner, different. And no one wanted to be different at the table. Not when hunger leveled everyone. Not when your lips had already been on the same spoon, your sleeves already brushed by the same hands. Even in noble halls, where goblets were etched and pitchers polished, the sharing was still real. Guests toasted from the same vessel. Wine was passed in ceremonial rounds. The object changed, but the practice didn't. One cup, many mouths, that was the rule. Illness came and went, of course, but no one linked it to the drink. Not yet. Coughs were blamed on bad air, fever on sin or punishment, or the turning of the season. If someone fell ill after the meal, the cup wasn't burned or even washed. It was simply dried, set aside, used again. The mouth wasn't feared. It was accepted. And more than that, it was normal. The same way hands touched bread. The same way the table held grease. The same way the dogs licked the floor clean. Everything at the table touched everything else. And the cup held the memory of that. Each lip print faded with the next. Each swallow erased what came before. And when the meal ended, and the jug was empty, and the cup sat there gleaming in the light of the fire, no one reached to wipe it. No one scoured the rim, because someone else would drink from it tomorrow. And that was as it should be. It wasn't a lapse. It wasn't a risk. It was belonging. The quiet, worn, invisible belonging of mouths sharing the same rim, over and over again night after night. You carried it on your belt, every day, everywhere, a small sturdy blade, not fancy, not particularly sharp, but always within reach. It cut bread in the morning, meat at midday, and string at dusk. If the heel of your boot needed prying or the thatch needed trimming, it did that too. And if you scraped your arm on a fence post or found a splinter deep in your finger, well, that same knife rinsed in a nearby stream or wiped once on your tunic would do the surgery. Knives weren't kitchen tools, they were life tools. You didn't leave home without it. You didn't hand it off easily. And yet it was used for nearly everything: cooking, eating, cleaning, stitching, skinning, trimming, bleeding. The line between food knife and personal blade didn't exist. There was only your knife. And if you didn't have one, you borrowed someone else's, but carefully, and always with a nod of respect. At the table, you used it first to cut your bread, hard, dark, often baked 2 days before, the crust thick enough to test the blade. Then meat, if you had it, or soft root vegetables. You held the food in your fingers and sliced with short, cautious movements. You wiped the blade on your sleeve. You never paused to clean it between uses, not after it scraped bone, not after it pierced cheese, not even after it trimmed your dirty fingernails earlier that morning. No one expected you to. It wasn't a matter of being crude, it was just that knives weren't separate from you. The blade wasn't in service of a kitchen, it was in service of you. So if you used it to lance a blister on your foot and then carve your meat, that wasn't carelessness. That was practicality. Blades were expensive. You didn't own more than one unless you were wealthy. Most people passed theirs down or had it reground by the smith when it dulled. A chipped edge was no reason to discard it. A bent tip could still carve, and if the handle split, you tied it with leather and carried on. Even women carried knives, though often smaller. They cut cloth, herbs, cheese, and bread. But if needed, those same blades helped with field work, with injury, with birth. A knife was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Children were taught early to respect the edge, not because it was sacred, but because it was always near. You didn't run with it, but you didn't put it down either. And if it was at the table, you didn't grab it from someone else's side. You waited, or asked, or used your fingers instead. And no one, absolutely no one, expected the knife to be washed between uses. It wiped clean enough on the crust of bread, or the table's edge, or the inside of your palm if you were quick. If blood stained the blade, you licked it, or used a rag, or dunked it in the stew, gave it a swirl, and then went back to eating. The knife didn't belong to the food. It belonged to life, and food was just one part of that. Which leads to a quiet question. When every cut was personal and every edge had been everywhere, Was the meal ever truly separate from the hand that brought it? It wasn't uncommon to see someone pause mid-meal, lift their tunic, and use the very knife they'd just sliced cheese with to dig out a thorn or open a pus-filled blister. The moment passed without remark. The knife was wiped once, maybe twice, on the corner of a cloak, then returned to the bread. There were no gasps, no raised brows, because no one saw the blade as belonging to the food. It belonged to the person, and people did what they had to do. You learned to handle it early. Before you could write your name, you knew how to slice a root without taking off your thumb. The edge wasn't razor sharp, most couldn't afford to keep it that way, but it was honed enough to work, to dig, to part fibres and crack rind. If you lost it, you didn't sleep well that night. If someone borrowed it and didn't return it, that was a mark against them you wouldn't forget. In town, the blacksmith might offer a grinding once a season, blades filed against stone polished with oil and rags. But between those visits, the knife simply aged with you. It darkened. The handle soaked up soaked sweat. The edge chipped and warped. And still it worked. It cut the tough heel off a loaf in the morning. It pried a nail loose from a cracked door frame at midday. It bled a chicken at dusk. It trimmed the bark from a walking stick. And then, when dinner came, it returned to your hand again. No cleaner, no sharper, just familiar. In monasteries, blades were shared and labelled, but not much cleaner. The same knife used to cut herbs from the cloister garden might also shave candle wax or trim dried meat for the abbot. Washing it was not routine. Wiping it on the edge of a habit or the side of a table was enough. You didn't sterilise what you trusted. You just kept it close. Sometimes you even used it to stir the pot, when spoons were short or the ladle had cracked. The tip would tap against the bottom of the kettle, mixing lentils and barley, while you balanced the handle with fingers already browned from work. Then, without pause, you'd pull it out and carve something else. Softened roots, salted larder, a piece of pottage-caked bread, and everyone at the table did the same. No one thought it strange to scrape the dirt out from under your nails and then use the same knife to slice cheese. The mouth accepted what the hands gave it, and the hands trusted the blade. It wasn't a question of sanitation, it was rhythm. You used the knife because it was yours, because it was there, because it worked. You never sharpened it before dinner. You never cleaned it afterward. It was a companion, not a utensil. And it bore the memory of every cut you'd made that day. Some across bread, some across skin, some across things harder to name. And maybe that's what made it safe in its own way. Because the knife, more than the bowl or the spoon or the fire, stayed with you. And if you handed it to someone else, you weren't just passing steel, you were offering a piece of yourself. By the time the meal was over, the knife had done half a dozen things, none of them particularly hygienic. It had cut through rind and cloth, it had pried a nail from the bench leg, it had split a loaf, divided a chunk of pork fat and dug something from a cracked fingernail, it had scraped black crust from a bowl, and it had been licked, at least once, by someone wiping grease from its edge before slipping it back into a leather sheath. And still it would be used again before nightfall. In the medieval world, tools weren't specialised. A knife wasn't marked kitchen or personal or surgical. It was a blade. That was enough. You didn't own things for categories, you owned them for purpose. And if a single tool could fill several roles, so much the better. You didn't clean it to switch uses. You understood it, you respected it, and you kept using it. A good blade gained a kind of authority with time. You could tell how long someone had owned theirs by how smooth the handle had become, how many layers of fabric were tied around a cracked grip, how quickly their thumb found the worn groove just behind the tip. The knife lived through all seasons, cutting fruit in summer, cutting meat in winter, cutting kindling in spring, cutting cloth when mending had to come before food. If it rusted, you scraped it. If it dulled, you adjusted your pressure. But you never doubted it. Even death didn't stop the blade's work. If a neighbour passed, it was their knife that cut the cords for the burial cloth. If a beast was injured, it was the same blade that ended its pain. Then hours later, it returned to bread and stew as if the day hadn't happened. Because the blade outlived events. It served the living and by doing so remembered the dead. People didn't speak about this directly, but they understood it. They passed blades down, father to son, mother to daughter, not because the knives were fine or valuable, but because they had history. You trusted a knife that had cut through 100 crusts. You knew how to hold it, and more importantly, it knew you. So when it touched food, there was no fear. Not even when you'd seen it dig into flesh just hours before. Not even when it had been used to open boils or shear hair or scrape sap. You wiped it. You used it. You moved on. It was never clean. It was simply present. and in a world where few things were reliable, the knife's presence was comfort enough. The same hand held it for work, for blood, for bread. The same hand passed it across the table, and the same mouth took food from its edge without pause. So maybe the knife was never really about danger or hygiene. Maybe it was just the sharp, silent agreement everyone had with their world. That what was carried, what was touched, what was shared, was never separate from what was eaten. Dust was everywhere. It coated the table before meals and again after. It drifted from the rafters in shafts of sun. It crept into baskets, clung to cloth, and settled quietly over the food even as it was being eaten. No one expected otherwise. Dust was part of the house, just like the creak of the boards, the smoke in the air, the smell of old fat near the fire. You didn't clean it. You didn't stop the meal because of it. You simply ate around it, or with it. The floor was often hard-packed earth. In some homes, it was strewn with rushes or straw to soak up spills and soften footsteps, but those rushes were rarely changed. Bits of old food, hair, soot, and ash collected between the blades. Sometimes herbs were mixed in to sweeten the smell, thyme and lavender, rosemary, but they didn't clean anything. They masked it. The dust remained. It rose in small clouds every time someone moved a bench or scuffed a boot. And when food was served, bread cut, bowls filled, ladles dipped, it drifted down softly like seasoning. No one batted it away. There was no cloth cover, no lid to lift dramatically and reveal a pristine roast. A trencher sat open to the air. Pottage steamed and cooled, and the dust settled in. Your hands weren't clean, your apron wasn't clean, the air certainly wasn't. So why would the food be? It wasn't a failing, it was just life. People expected their meals to be touched by the place they were made in. The smoke from the hearth, the straw from the floor, the smell of horses from just outside the door, everything mingled, and dust was the most persistent of them all. You wiped it off a cup rim with your thumb, you brushed it from a cut of bread before tearing in, you spat out a grit of ash between bites of turnip and carried on chewing. Even in castles, the kitchens were dusty, the stone floors trapped grime in their cracks. The windows were small, the soot from the hearth never quite escaped. Food might be cooked in vast hearths or behind heavy oak doors, but when it was brought out, by hand, on platters, uncovered, it collected dust along the way, from servant to corridor to table, from hall to mouth, and no one scolded the dust. It was too ordinary to fight. You didn't see it as a threat. You saw it as texture. Sometimes the bread already had dust baked into its crust, flour left unbrushed, or wood ash from the baking hearth. That first crunch, it might be wheat or it might be dirt. Either way you bit again. And if your teeth met something small and hard, you hoped it was grit and not bone. Meals weren't sanitized performances. They were acts of use, of gathering, of making do. And dust simply came with the meal, the way wind came with the door or smoke came with the fire. Which leads to a final thought. If every bite carried a trace of where it came from, wasn't the dust just another reminder that you were home? There was a crunch sometimes, soft but distinct. Between the chew of bread or in the back of your molars after a bite of boiled grain, it wasn't bone or shell or anything prepared. It was grit, dust, the kind that settled in flour sacks, clung to the grain mill's stones, floated down from beams where spiders spun undisturbed. You didn't pick it out, you didn't mention it. You swallowed, rinsed with ale, and kept going. Because to complain about dust in your food was like complaining about the dark when the sun went down. It was simply part of the meal. The grinding of flour brought dust of its own. The stones were rarely cleaned, and even if they were, they left behind tiny flecks. Sand, stone, wood from the paddles, even bits of mouse droppings when pests got to the storage bins. And that flour still got baked. Bread wasn't sifted or refined. It was rough, honest, and often greyish in tone. You tore it, dipped it in broth, and if your teeth scraped against something unpleasant, you stopped chewing just long enough to decide whether it was worth spitting out. But most of the time you just swallowed, because that was quicker, and because the dust wasn't dangerous, not in a way that people could see. It didn't cause panic, it caused texture. That was the word people might have used if they had had one for it. A little bit of dust in the stew, it meant the lid was left off. Dust on the dried apples, it meant they had lasted the winter. Dust on the smoked meat, a good sign. It meant it had been left alone long enough to age. Even the salt, when you could afford it, might carry dust, traded in cloth sacks, stored in corners where the broom never reached. You lived with it. The fire brought more. Ash didn't stay in the hearth. It rose with every gust, settled again when the door opened. If someone stirred the fire mid-meal, you might see a thin veil of soot settle across the table. You kept eating. No one wiped the table between courses. No one wiped their hands before serving. No one wiped the plate after it had been set down. Dust lived on every surface and meals moved around it, not in spite of it. Children learned young not to fuss. They chewed the crust, even if it tasted slightly of straw. They bit into onions speckled with soil from the garden. They drank from cups with flecks of floating ash, and learned to tilt the cups slightly, letting the worst of it sink. That was etiquette, not avoiding the dust, managing it, adapting to it. The body did the same. It grumbled, coughed, occasionally protested in more violent ways, but more often than not, it simply adjusted. Because in the medieval kitchen, there was no purity, only presence. Only what had been brought in from the field, from the root cellar, from the smoky lofts above, and no matter how careful you were, you never served food untouched by the place it came from. So the dust was part of the story, the texture, the taste, the reminder that this bread, this soup, this bite of boiled meat, it all came from a house that lived and breathed around you. You didn't expect anything cleaner. You didn't wish for anything finer. You just hoped the grit stayed small enough not to chip a tooth. When the meal was done and the bowls scraped clean, the table still looked like it had hosted a dust storm. Bits of bread crust clung to the edges. A few drops of broth had dried into a dark stain. Beneath every bowl, a fine ring of soot, ash, and flour traced where food had sat. Someone might give it a half-hearted swipe with a sleeve, or a child might drag the end of a cloth across the bench. But no one expected the table to gleam. No one thought it should, because the idea that a meal should be clean from start to finish didn't exist. You cleaned after if you had time, and even then you didn't clean to remove bacteria. You cleaned to make space. The crumbs and dust and streaks of fat were just proof that the table had done its job. Everything you ate had been exposed to the room, to the air, to the fire, to the floor. The drying apples had sat in the attic, open to mice and moths. The grains had been hauled in sacks through the dirt and stomped on by feet. The salt pork had hung near the fire, where soot gathered like a second skin. When you sliced it, that skin went into the stew with the rest. You didn't trim it away. Why would you? You had eaten worse. Dust had settled on the bread while it cooled on the window ledge. It had floated into the milk, rested on the cheesecloth, gotten into the bowl you hadn't turned upside down in time. So you stopped worrying. And you ate. The house had its own rhythms. People walked in and out. Animals wandered close. Doors rarely stayed shut. The walls breathed dust and draught with the same ease, and in the centre of it all sat the table, greasy, dented, and ringed with the trace of many meals. The idea that food should be protected, sealed, sterilised, that it should be separate from the home, would have made no sense. In fact, it would have seemed wasteful, suspicious even. If a piece of bread looked too clean, too white, too smooth, you might not trust it. Real food wore its origins. It tasted of the place it came from. It looked like the air around it, and if you bit down on a bit of grit or coughed on ash, you didn't flinch. You drank something. You chewed slower. You didn't blame the cook, because dust wasn't a mistake. It was just part of life. It lived in the walls, the rafters, the bowls, and the bread. And for all the trouble it brought, itchy noses, scratched throats, dirty collars, it also brought a kind of peace, because once you stopped trying to avoid it, you stopped being surprised by it. You just breathed in, passed the loaf, and bit again. And maybe that's why no one minded when the dust settled in the stew, because everyone at the table had already carried it in with them. The floor caught everything. Bones, bread crusts, spilled broth, bits of onion, torn leaves, a spoon knocked down by a careless elbow, it all ended up there. And no one gasped or hurried to clean it. In most medieval homes, the floor was not just something you walked on, it was part of the meal, a silent partner in the act of eating. It received what the table could not hold, absorbed what the trenchers could not catch, and sometimes when food was scarce, gave a little something back. Most houses had hard-packed earth underfoot. In winter it froze solid. In summer it cracked. And it was always dusty. But people layered it, first with straw, then rushes, sometimes herbs, anything that could cushion a step and absorb a spill. The result wasn't clean, but it was functional. You dropped your trencher crust, it landed in hay. You lost your spoon, you picked it up, wiped it once, and used it again. The floor wasn't sewered, but it wasn't filthy in the modern sense. It was normal. Dogs slept there, babies crawled there. Chickens, on occasion, wandered through. and when a bit of gristle fell or a spoonful of beans splattered sideways, it simply became part of the layer. Maybe someone would sweep it later. More likely the dog would find it first. Children were used to eating near the floor. They sat on low stools or the edge of a bench, legs folded, fingers busy. If food tumbled down, it was considered fair game. You snatched it up quick if you wanted it. You brushed off a bit of straw and popped it in your mouth. If your mother saw you do it, she didn't scold, she only said, "Don't fight the dog for it." Because everyone knew the floor was for scraps, but sometimes scraps were still food, and the line between those things was thin. In poorer homes, meals were built from what had been dropped and saved. Crumbs swept into a pot, bones boiled twice, a lump of porridge scraped from the corner of a board and fried for the next day. A bit of dried crust picked from under the bench, softened in broth, and added to someone's bowl when they weren't looking. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was nearly unthinkable. In noble halls, the floor told its own story. You'd find the remains of a feast, feathers from a plucked bird, chewed bones, bits of pastry, spilled wine dried into the rushes. Servants swept it, yes, but only after the lords had gone. Until then, it sat quietly underfoot, ignored by those too full to notice and too used to the mess to care. Monasteries were stricter, but even there, the floor bore the burden of dropped beans, of crusts fallen during silence, of apples bruised from careless hands. And no one made a fuss. The brothers swept in silence. The floor forgave. The truth was simple. The table might feed you, but the floor remembered what you didn't finish. And once in a while, when the bowl was empty and the cupboard bare, someone reached down and ate what the floor had held. You didn't throw food away in the Middle Ages, not because you were disciplined, but because there was nowhere to throw it. There were no bins lined with cloth or baskets labelled waste. The idea of scraping a plate clean into something separate didn't exist. The plate was already a crust of bread, and anything that didn't make it to your mouth either got eaten later or landed on the floor. That floor, layered with rushes, hay, bits of leaf, of sometimes even moss, became the catch-all of the meal. Quiet, dusty, and always waiting. What dropped didn't vanish. It became a decision. You looked at the piece of meat that had slipped off your trencher. If it landed in a dry patch of straw, you reached down, picked it up, wiped it off on your sleeve and ate. If it rolled toward the hearth, picked up ash and started to curl at the edges from the heat, you left it. Unless you were very hungry, and often people were. That made the floor part of the mealtime economy. It wasn't waste, it was potential. It held tomorrow's broth. It held food for the dog, for the baby too small for real bread, for the poorest in the house who waited for what others didn't finish. Some scraps were deliberately dropped. A half-bitten crust. A bit of turnip someone couldn't chew. You didn't ask for it, you let it fall. Quietly. And someone else, someone watching, someone used to hunger, picked it up. In the kitchens of the wealthy, servants swept the floor with care. After the eating was done, the rushes were tossed and replaced, sometimes even sprinkled with fresh herbs. But that was ceremony, not sanitation. During the meal, the dogs wandered freely, licking at puddles of gravy, gnawing what had dropped. Bones clattered, peels and cores and spittle-specked crusts vanished beneath the bubble. And the people above barely noticed. Children learned early not to fear the floor. It was where toys were carved, where babies were born, where stories were told on winter nights. And yes, it was where food landed, and where it could be found again. If a bit of cheese slipped off a trencher, you didn't cry, you reached. And if your mother snapped at you, it wasn't because you touched the floor, it was because you hesitated too long and the dog got there first. In lean months, the floor was watched carefully. Nothing that dropped stayed long. A smear of barley on a board was scraped up with a finger. A lump of gristle kicked under the bench was sniffed, tested, eaten. Dust didn't matter. Ash didn't matter. It was warm, it was chewable, and it kept your stomach quiet for an hour more. So the floor became something more than a surface. It became a layer of memory. Of meals passed, of choices made, of what was shared and what was given without saying. Not every house swept, not every house had rushes, but every house had hunger. And hunger always looked down before it looked away, which makes you wonder, when the ground beneath the table knew more of the meal than the hands on top of it, where did eating really end? After the meal, the table grew quiet, but the floor told the story of what had been eaten. A bone licked clean and discarded underfoot. A soggy crust pressed flat where someone stepped on it barefoot. Onion skins, beet peels, the rind of a hard cheese someone tried to bite through and gave up on, all scattered in no particular order, woven into the straw like puzzle pieces of a finished supper. No one rushed to clean it. The floor was not a mess to fix, it was a witness. It absorbed what couldn't be chewed, what was too tough, too cold, too gnawed through to finish. The dogs would get to it first, circling and sniffing, noses twitching. What they left behind might be swept tomorrow or the next day or never. It didn't matter, because cleaning wasn't urgent. The floor would hold it all. It had been holding it for weeks. The layers of rushes covered everything, crumbs from yesterday, grease from last week's stew, drop of milk turned sour in the corner. Sometimes you added fresh straw, sometimes you didn't. You scattered mint or lavender to cover the smell, and when the scent faded, you got used to it. The floor bore the weight of every meal, and sometimes it gave something back. If you were desperate or small or unnoticed, you might crawl under the bench after supper and find something salvageable. A piece of turnip no one had seen fall, a spoon someone had kicked aside, a heel of bread that had dried into something near stone but still edible if soaked. These weren't accidents, they were possibilities. In noble halls, the fallen scraps were swept aside with long-handled brooms, sometimes by servants, sometimes by dogs. The rushes were tossed only when they became too thick, too foul, too noisy with pests. And even then, they weren't burned. They were fed to the pigs, because even the filth of the meal had purpose. In humble homes, the sweepings might be left in the corner of the room for days. You didn't waste the effort of cleaning when there was still food to be found beneath the table. And in monasteries, where silence reigned, no one commented when a brother stooped to retrieve a bean that had rolled across the stone. Hunger didn't speak aloud, but it still knew where to look. The floor wasn't shameful, it was honest. It showed what you didn't finish, what you pretended not to want, what you dropped on purpose or with carelessness, or because your hands were too tired to hold steady, and that honesty was accepted, because not every part of the meal made it to the mouth. Some of it landed below, quiet, forgotten, or quietly reclaimed. So if you asked someone what had been eaten that night, they might glance at the table, but if you wanted the truth, you looked at the floor, because the floor never lied. You didn't stop working just because it was time to eat. You crouched, leaned against a tree stump, or found a spot where the sun hadn't yet baked the ground too hard. There was no blanket, no picnic, no clean break between labour and lunch. You kept the sickle nearby, you sat with your boots still caked in mud, your hands stained with sap or soil or both, reached into the cloth bundle tied to your belt. That was lunch. The food was simple, cold and dusty, a hard crust of bread, piece of cheese, maybe sour at the edges, an onion if the field had been kind, and it came with dirt. Always. Dirt under your nails, dirt on your lips, dirt baked into the folds of your tunic. You might brush your bread on your leg to clear it off, but the leg was dusty too. You chewed anyway. Water, if there was any, came from a flask or a shared cup passed from hand to hand, warm from the samp and faintly metallic from the jug. You sipped slowly, not to savour it, but to make sure there'd be some left when the day was hotter. The same hands that tilled the soil held the food. The same hands wiped sweat from your brow and then tore into bread. There was no pause to wash, no pause for anything, really. And if a fly landed on your cheese, you flicked it off and kept eating. There was no time to be delicate. The ground you sat on was the same ground you'd turned with a spade an hour earlier. The same ground where someone had just relieved themselves behind a bush. The same ground where your neighbour's child had learned to walk. There was no sacred boundary between earth and table. There was only need. Sometimes someone brought a small cloth or a broken board to rest the food on, but even then it slid. Crumbs fell, bits of straw clung to cheese. A potato rolled through dust and was picked up again. You rubbed it off, you cut it open. You passed a piece to the person beside you without apology. Lunch in the fields wasn't a moment of rest, it was an extension of the morning's work. Quieter maybe, but still rough. You ate quickly, always looking at the clouds, the angle of the sun, the slope of the shadows. The day was always slipping past you, and the food was just one more thing to finish. No one asked if the food was clean. Clean compared to what? Your hands were not clean. Your tools were not clean. Your mouth had tasted dust since dawn, and yet somehow it all came together. You chewed slowly, you watched the birds, you swallowed grit without thinking, and you felt full. Not because the meal was large, but because you'd stopped long enough to notice the taste of bread, even if it tasted faintly of soil. By midday, your hands didn't feel like yours anymore. They were cracked from rope, stiff from cold, raw from nettles or sun. They trembled a little as you tore open the cloth that held your meal. But still, you didn't stop. You used the edge of a thumbnail to slice a hunk of bread from a larger piece. The knife wasn't sharp, it had dug into roots earlier. It had scraped bark off a stick. Now it carved food. That was normal. Your fingers left prints in the cheese, real prints, dark-edged, packed with grit. The bread had lines of dust where it had rubbed against the inside of your sack. The knife carried a taste of wood and maybe iron. And still you brought it all to your mouth with the hunger of someone who didn't have the time or the energy to be cautious. You ate where you stood or crouched or sat. On a stone, a fence rail, a cartwheel. You shared space with flies, with chickens if they wandered close, with the sharp smell of manure still rising from the far corner of the field. The air was thick, sometimes with dust, sometimes with pollen, sometimes with the smoke from a nearby cook fire. You swallowed it all. You chewed fast. You didn't linger on textures. You didn't stop when your teeth met something tough or strange. If your lips caught straw, you pulled it away. If your bread held a grain of dirt, you ground it between your molars and kept going. Because what mattered wasn't how you ate. It was that you ate. Your body needed to move again soon. Your hands needed to grip again. Your legs needed to lift again. The lunch wasn't a pause, it was fuel. And it wasn't quiet either. There was talk, quick, low, about the weather, the yield, the neighbour's cow. But no one spoke about the food. There was nothing to say. It was bread, it was cheese, maybe a bit of salted meat, a leek if you were lucky. The sameness of it didn't invite discussion. It invited chewing. The children, if they were there, ate with just as much dirt on their fingers. They bit into apples dropped in the soil. They licked butter from bread already streaked with brown. They smiled with faces flecked in dust and mouths full of crumbs, and no one stopped them to say, wipe that off, because there was nothing wrong with it. It was the same as everyone else. The earth clung to your skin and your clothes and your meal, and you let it. Because to strip it all away would have meant you hadn't worked, hadn't earned this small rest, this handful of food in the shade of a wagon wheel. So you ate. And when you stood again, you felt the weight of bread and dust and effort settle in your stomach together. The wind picked up toward the end of lunch, and with it came more dust. It swept across the field, light but constant, settling on the cheese you hadn't yet finished, and the cloth where your last crust of bread rested. You didn't cover the food, there was nothing to cover it with. You picked up the crust, gave it a shake, brushed it once with the side of your thumb and finished the bite. The crunch of sand between your teeth was familiar. You swallowed it like everything else. You stood slowly, your knees stiff from crouching, your back sore from sitting on nothing but the slope of the earth. You tied the corners of the cloth again, not to seal it, but to hold the knife, the rind, the crumbs. You'd carry it with you, maybe eat what was left on the walk home, maybe give it to the child waiting at the edge of the field, maybe forget about it until tomorrow. The food inside would keep, it always did. Dust didn't ruin food, time did, and you didn't have enough of that to waste. Some days lunch was a luxury. There were times when you went from dawn until dusk with only a swallow of ale or a bite of raw onion. Other days you were luckier. Someone shared a heel of meat. Someone brought pears from a tree, a small miracle in the shape of flavour. But no matter how good the food was, or how poor, it tasted of the field, always. It carried the warmth of your palms, the wet grit from your thumb, the smell of earth that never fully left your hands. And maybe that was the flavour you came to expect. You didn't look for it. You didn't want it, but you accepted it. The same way you accepted cracked nails and dry skin and the ache behind your eyes. It was part of the meal, part of the day, part of you. Even if you brought food from home, wrapped in cloth or stored in a cracked pot, it never stayed clean. The jostling walk, the dusty path, the constant lifting and lowering of sacks, tools and tired bodies. Everything touched everything. And that meant the dirt touched everything too. You learned to ignore it. Not by force, but by familiarity. A mouthful of rye bread that scraped your throat. A smear of something unidentifiable on a hunk of cheese. A cup of water with a green fleck you chose not to notice. You didn't stop eating. You adjusted your expectations, because in the field, food was food. And the line between what we eat and what we live in was thinner than dust itself. So when the day drew long and the sun sank lower, and someone asked, "Did you eat?" You didn't list what you had, you just said yes, and felt the weight of bread and soil and silence sitting warm in your stomach. As the sounds of wooden benches, clinking spoons, and distant laughter fade into silence, a feeling remains, one of enduring simplicity. Even amid the grit and rough texture of medieval life, there was comfort in sharing food and warmth in gathering close. A reminder that even in the most rugged of times, the smallest rituals of eating, of resting, of simply being carried us forward. And now there are no more stories to follow tonight, only the hush of history and your own peaceful breath. Let the world fade away. May you find calm, and may your dreams be gentle and deep.